Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome back to Squeeze Fan TV, the world's only daily Squeeze vlog. Almost forgot my lines then. I've got a bit of hay fever today, which is why my eyes look a bit strange. So anyway, today's video, I'm going to talk about this. Is Difford Tilbrook Squeeze? Is the Difford Tilbrook album Squeeze? Now this has come up on the Squeeze Facebook group a couple of times, and I think it's quite an interesting topic. So obviously, Squeeze broke up in 1982. Glenn and Chris decided to disband the band and then immediately reconfigure themselves as Difford Tilbrook. So Gilson Lavis, John Bentley and Don Snow were let go. And Glenn and Chris continued with Keith Wilkinson, who was a session man at the time, session guy, another guy called Andy Duncan, and there may have been a couple of other musicians. Not sure. I never saw the Difford Tilbrook band live, but essentially that's what happened. They decided to ditch the Squeeze name, disband the group, and then move forward with this career, Difford Tilbrook. What's amazing, actually, when you look back at some of the interviews that they did at the time, they used to say things like, oh, we're not going to perform Squeeze songs. We're just going to do new songs by Difford Tilbrook. And it seems extraordinary to me that at the time, Chris and Glenn were only in their 20s, and Squeeze hadn't really broken through as a really big act. I mean, they'd done Madison Square Garden, they'd had some chart success in the UK, and they were a well-loved band, you know, but they hadn't really they hadn't cracked it as far as being, you know, a really huge band. And they just decided, for whatever reason, that Squeeze had run its course and they just didn't want to do it anymore. So essentially what was going on there, I think a few different things were happening behind the scenes. There were problems in the lineup at the time, interpersonal problems in the band. I think Chris and Glenn were having some problems as well with the other members, in terms of maybe the other musicians wanting to not muscle in on the songwriting, but maybe start to take some credit here and there. You know, it sort of happened again later with Keith Wilkinson on the Ridiculous album and Some Fantastic Place. You know, musicians who've been in a band for a long time, they like to feel involved. It's, you know, perfectly reasonable. Jules Holland wrote with Chris originally, but, you know, over time, Squeeze turned into Difford Tilbrook. It was their songs, it was their vision, and really Gilson and John Bentley and Don Snow were really kind of, in a way, they were just sort of backup musicians, really. It sounds a bit unkind to say that. But Chris and Glenn I think at the time they had this sort of vision in their minds that Squeeze were not just a brand, they were actually a band. And I think they were, even though they were having problems with the other guys in the band, I think they thought, well, we can't just disband it and carry on with other people and keep calling it Squeeze. That didn't seem to be an option. I think it was because at the time, even though there'd been lineup changes and that had really annoyed them. I think, you know, Chris in particular was getting really annoyed by the revolving keyboard player problem. But they had managed to kind of keep it together. You know, they would change a bass player, the keyboard player would change, but there was always, essentially Gilson was always there as a kind of, you know, constant. John Bentley had been a constant from Argy Bargy, Side Story and Sweet Summer Stranger. So there was a bit of constancy going on there. So essentially they just didn't want to ditch everybody and keep calling it Squeeze. Much later on, of course, you know, years and years later, Chris and Glenn realised actually what they did have really was a brand rather than a band. And, you know, from the Some Fantastic Place onwards, you know, Ridiculous, you know, every album had a different drummer, every tour had a different keyboard player, and it really didn't matter anymore. And everybody kind of accepted that Squeeze was just Difford Tilbrook and whoever they wanted to work with. I think the group they've got now actually is pretty damn good, in the sense that the musicians seem to have gelled, and you know, it's been the same lineup for a while. That worked. That works. Anyway, off topic. So when Difford Tilbrook came out as an album, it was definitely meant to be not Squeeze. And I can remember getting this album, and I really didn't like it at all when I first got it. It came out in 84, didn't it? So I was 13. And, you know, I've been a big Squeeze fan in my childhood, and I've been heartbroken when they broke up in 82. I didn't really know anything about this. You know, I didn't read the music papers or anything. It came out and I got it, and I didn't like anything about it. I didn't like the way they looked on the cover. I didn't like the style of the music. You know, the drumming sounded wrong. It wasn't Gilson. And I just thought to myself, what's the point of this? What's the point of doing this? Why didn't they just make another Squeeze album? So historically, my attitude towards this has always been, yeah, this is definitely not Squeeze. This is Difford Tilbrook. Although it's quite funny, just now I went to get the album from the shelf in order to make the video. And I went to the D section and it wasn't there. Went to the Squeeze section and I filed it under Squeeze. So maybe over time, I think that's what's happened. Over time, people have started to view it as, oh yeah, it's that weird period where they broke Squeeze up, but it really was Squeeze. It's just that they didn't call it that. They didn't want to call it that. It was the Difford Tilbrook band. And it's amazing to think, isn't it, that if this album had been a hit and if the tour had been a big success, would Chris and Glenn even have returned to the Squeeze name, or would they have been like Hall & Oates? Because that, I assume that was the intention, was to become a kind of Hall & Oates, Difford Tilbrook, and I think they wanted to, dovetail into doing musicals and do different things, maybe write for other people. I think they had all kinds of ideas in mind, but maybe when they stepped out into that harsh, cold world of not being in Squeeze anymore, not having that Squeeze name, they quickly kind of realised that maybe things were not going to work out quite so well, and that they better get the band back together. And it's interesting that when they got the band back together, they were very careful to reassemble it as Squeeze, as it had been known. Apart from John Bentley, you had Gilson Lavis back in the fold, you had Jules Holland, and then that lineup then continued for a few albums. So the Difford Tilbrook album, I think for years it was seen as a glitch. It was definitely a glitch. It wasn't just a continuation, it wasn't a continuum. And the music is different. I think, the changes that Glenn had started to put in place had started, I think, on Sweet from a Stranger. He'd started doing that blue-eyed soul thing, which really dates back to Tempted, really, on East Side Story, which Paul Carrack sang, of course, but then Glenn did Black Coffee in Bed. So he was moving into that sort of adult contemporary field, and he would pursue that later in the decade, with Squeeze, albums like Cozy Fan and Babylon and On. They've got more of a kind of adult contemporary blue-eyed soul thing going on, quite different to the first four albums. But on this album, Glenn really took that, as far as he could. I'm not going to review the album now because I'm going to do that in a separate video, but it was a flawed album. There were problems with the producer, Tony Visconti, and it was taken away from Visconti and remixed, and the drums are way too loud. And I think the problem with the album is, even though it's got some great material on it, it sounds like session men, essentially. I think Keith Wilkinson, when he made Cozy Friend Tutti Frutti, it's interesting because that album was called Squeeze, but it was still Glenn, Chris and Keith, just the same. But something happened to Keith's bass playing. When they called it Squeeze again, he seemed to find his groove, and the bass lines on Cozy Friend Tutti Frutti and Babylon and On, they sound far more of a piece with Chris and Glenn. On this album, Keith, he does just kind of sound like he's playing the parts, like he's clocking in and playing the parts. Andy Duncan certainly sounds like that. His drumming is quite, it's very straightforward. It's not particularly imaginative. It sounds to me like he's just doing a job. It would be great to hear this album remixed and, to have some TLC lavished on it. I don't know whether that will ever happen. I don't really know what Chris and Glenn think of this album now. I mean, they never particularly talk about it. Love's Crashing Waves, of course, has been performed live by Squeeze, and that's interesting as well. That has now been reclaimed. That's now in the Squeeze canon, even though it was not a Squeeze song originally. I can imagine if you came to the band much later and you learned about this album, you might kind of think of it as being, oh yeah, that's just like another Squeeze album essentially. But I think if you were around at the time, it feels quite different, and I've never really thought of this as being a Squeeze album, even though I am filing it under S now, so what do I know? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little discussion. Let me know what you think, whether you think that the Difford Tilbrook album is Squeeze or not. It's very important that we discuss these matters in depth, so do leave a comment, and thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.